Great. It's so nice to be here. It's really great to have been invited. So thanks so much for the invitation. So I just updated my job. I graduated with my dissertation with my PhD from UC Davis, and now I'm a postdoc at University of Chicago. So I say that in case there's anyone out there getting a PhD, if there is light at the end of the tunnel, it happens, you can graduate. So this was my job market paper though, and so it's something that's I'm really delighted to be able to share here. And I do see that some of my colleagues from Tanzania are on the call, which is really exciting. So welcome to this as well. So I'll skip those slides and get right into the motivation. And so I think what's particularly interesting for this audience is that we're talking about ICTs, so information and communication technology in a low resource setting, in a developing country setting. So there's been a lot of work on how mobile phones, the introduction of mobile phones in the first place, lowered price dispersion in agricultural resource and labor markets. And then there's also some increasing information about how mobile technologies can increase adoption of agriculture technology. So this is kind of the work that I'm moving into now in my postdoc, but there are sort of mobile phone based applications that are designed to give extension services and advice. So the bottom line here being that these new information and communication technology have the potential to change how firms interact with both their suppliers and their customers. And so since this is a setting where we're sort of introducing for the first time a new digital technology, it really presents a unique opportunity to really study how those supply chain linkages change afterwards. So just to settle us into some of the bigger things that are swirling around the market, this really caught my eye. This is I'm highlighting a new, relatively new tech company that started in Nairobi. It's called Soko Watch, and they're designed as a B2B platform, so facilitating business to business transactions along kind of small firm supply chains. And so of course, the way they describe themselves as, sort of serving this enormous population of potentially 10 million informal shops selling 180 billion worth of goods every year. And the idea is that these shops routinely stock out of products and have limited access to financial services. So these types of startups are linking those firms for the first time to financial markets. And so this is something that is valued at 14 million in Series A funding. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is like a little bit more humble than that, but it's to sort of just situate us in this idea that people are paying attention to supply chains in this setting. So what we're studying with my colleagues at the Institute of Rural Development Planning, which are the colleagues in Tanzania that I mentioned earlier, and also colleagues at Cornell University and University of Washington. We developed a digital phone book that's accessible on any type of phone. So here I have pictured this sort of feature phone, as they're called, and you can design applications that are in USSD that can create any type of application that is relevant for people. So in this case, we're just listing business phone numbers and contact information. So as you can see here, it's sort of a menu system, and you can browse by location, you can browse by sector, you can do just a Boolean search, and then it's going to give you different windows with different numbers that you can type in to have the full menu come out. And the idea being at the end screen, you can sort of reach the name of a business and a phone number. So that's sort of the technology that we're working on. And so then now let me talk a little bit more about what I'm thinking about in terms of what an urban to rural supply chain is. So you can just imagine a rural area. I have this like really stylized like supply chain that I'm going to describe for y'all. So in a rural area, I suppose there's just like villages, and there's small firms that are located within those villages. So those rural firms are going to sell to rural customers, and these rural customers are both located in the same community and surrounding communities. So there's sort of just this like linkages created along the supply chain. And so the types of firms that I'm focusing on include any type of retail or service firm. So retail firms are going to be those that just purchase inputs and sell them at a markup. They're going to sell relatively homogeneous items like rice, beans, tea, soap, sort of basic general food stores, dry goods stores, vegetable sellers, pharmacies, that kind of thing. And then on the service side, these are going to be firms that are sourcing an intermediate input and engaging in some kind of value added production or service provision. So these are welders, mechanics, tailors, barbers, restaurants. It's quite common for sunflower oil to be processed here. So the idea is just that even these service firms are sourcing inputs from urban areas, right? So both retail and service have a little bit of a different like cost structure and different operations, but in either case, there's tending to still source inputs from urban areas. So here we can bring in the urban firms into my stylized kind of supply chain here. So these rural firms have relationships with some urban firms, but not others. And of course, it can be really costly to search for new business partners in an urban setting. And so when we put this together, we're sort of linking up this supply chain. And so what the research design that I'll describe now is was basically focused on those rural firms, so that middle part of the supply chain. So what we did was we randomly selected 25 villages in this, I have a map I'll show you in a second, in central Tanzania. And we were careful to select them so that they were sort of centered around 3 different urban trading hubs. And so they're stratified on the region, the population, and the density and the distance to the nearest city. So you can sort of imagine they're sort of evenly dispersed. And so some are going to have kind of relatively small transaction costs to reach a city, and then while others are going to have pretty substantial transaction costs to reach a city. But those are going to be evenly dispersed across all arms for these purposes. So we invited 507 firms to list their phone number in the phone book. And then we asked them if we can follow up with them with some phone surveys and some questions. And so then from there, those 507 rural firms were split into 2 different treatment arms and a control. So let me describe those now. So when I'm talking about sort of the urban to rural supply chain, and there's sort of the upstream, so it's upstream from the rural firm's perspective. So those are their suppliers or their upstream suppliers. And then on the downstream side, the downstream are the customers. So this, I guess this is like an IO setting, so I don't really probably have to drill this in as much, but you can imagine as I present this in different places, there's different things you have to emphasize. But so the upstream treatment, those are going to be rural firms who have their phone number made visible to urban firms. And then those urban firms are able to search for those rural firms, right? So you're just sort of like tightening up the linkage on the upstream side such that they can only search for each other. And then on the downstream side, we don't list customers. So the downstream treatment is that customers, they can use the product though. So when customers search on the phone book, they can search for these downstream firms, right? So all that it is, it's really quite simple, is that you're kind of increasing the probability of new contact on either side of the supply chain, right? And sort of being really intentional about who sees who. But the other thing that—
I have a question. So the upstream firms are producers of this, for instance, agricultural products. And
yeah,
the
so for the most
downstream
part,
downstream firm are the urban retailers, or is it correct?
yeah, so the upstream are actually going to be the urban retailers. And so I'll sometimes call them wholesalers or urban firms. And they were sort of invited to also list their phone number in the directory. And then since they are the input suppliers for rural firms, ultimately, that's sort of that's how they're connected there.
So
yeah. So they're only going to be retail firms, mostly retail and wholesale firms.
Right. So you mentioned like agricultural products, among others, and they are produced in the countryside, then they are purchased by urban firms, and then they distributed back to the rural retailers. Is it correct? So there's no like direct supply by farmers to retailers.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point, because there is a lot. So this is a maize producing and a sunflower producing region. And so there is going to be some sort of rural communities are going to be producing goods and then they sell it to the urban area. But I'm actually talking about, I'm more focused on the reverse supply chain. So this is going to be food and other products that aren't produced locally. So even, some households do produce beans, for example, and some households might produce rice, but by and large, those are products that they purchase from their local market. So those are going to be the main focus here.
I understand. All right.
So the last thing that I'm going to mention here, so I have the sort of upstream and downstream treatment arms, and then also both treatment arms have the ability to search for each other. So at the same time that there's sort of asymmetric linkages being created in either the upstream or downstream, both treatment arms are sort of getting linkages with other rural firms. And so I highlight that because that's going to be important in a little bit. Okay, so then if we're back to my stylized map, this is sort of what this looks like. So there's going to be the rural firms are going to be allocated into one treatment arm that's going to be designed to increase contact with upstream suppliers. Some are going to be withheld from the phone book and they're going to be the control group, while others are going to be in this downstream arm where they're going to be promoted to rural customers. And so it is worth mentioning now that this is a product that is now fully available to people. So there was only a limited amount of time that these firms were in the control group. Okay, so here's that map I promised you before. So here are those 3 large urban centers, and then the rural firms are sort of dispersed throughout them with some extras over here. And then these yellow dots are going to be where those rural customers are that I talked about. And so this basically just meant that the rollout took place in 3 phases. First, where we invited the rural firms, so the turquoise firms, and then we went back to the urban areas and invited urban firms to list their information. And then finally, we also randomly selected rural villages, which we went and introduced and promoted the phone book. So that was just an activity of gathering phone numbers so that we could assign them to the treatment. And then we could follow up with them and ask questions as well. Okay, so the main research questions are threefold. So the first being, does being listed in the phone book change incentives to engage in relational contracting with suppliers and with customers? And I'll define relational contracting shortly. And then, does being listed in the phone book lower search costs and affect firm productivity? And then finally, are firms more constrained by upstream or downstream search frictions? So getting to know these firms a little bit. Again, these are just the 507 rural firms. I have another paper that includes the urban firms, so happy to talk about them as well, but just not in this one as much. So there 36% are women owned, I like to point out. The firm average age is about 5.46. So in terms of firm tenure, these are firms that kind of have a pretty long tenure. But one thing that's important in this setting is that firms tend to jump in and out of operations. So the firm tenure may be 5.5 years, but sometimes the firm might close for the agricultural season. So these really are sort of small household businesses that are also operating and doing other activities. So I highlighted earlier that it works on any type of phone, and that's important in a rural setting, right? Because for smartphone ownership in rural areas, only about 24% of these businesses have a smartphone. Maybe that's changed now because it's increasing all the time. This is from 2019. And the distance to a major market is 65 kilometers. And then I also like to point out that the average number of other competitors is almost 5. And so again, this is to kind of highlight that these firms are operating in a rather competitive environment, just that they're not sort of the only firm that acts as sort of a village monopolist. So we don't have that. That's not the setting. Okay, so the empirical specification, I don't usually talk about this so much. I'm happy to discuss some of the details later, but it's just an ANCOVA specification. So that just means that I structure it so that the baseline outcome is added as a control variable. So it's added as a regressor, as a regression adjustment. So we can think of these estimates as an intent to treat within unit treatment effect. So just measuring the difference off of each individual firm and then averaging that. And so the treatment dummies are just the treatment one for upstream and treatment one for downstream. And so I also did a couple other things, like, so this also is going to include the strata indicators and then also this machine learning predictive treatment index. So these are kind of like some new methods that the idea is that when you're doing a balance, when you're testing for balance, you're going to have some spurious things that are out of balance. And so you can use machine learning to control for that imbalance. And then I'm also going to do multiple hypothesis testing at the outcome grouping level. I'll describe that later. And the standard errors are clustered at the firm level. The main outcomes are going to be grouped into these 3 different categories, and these are matched to the research question. So first going to talk about the relational contracting outcomes, and then I'll discuss the productivity outcomes, and then phone book usage. Okay, so relational contracting is a fun part of the IO literature, obviously, as everyone here probably agrees. And so the sort of definition that everyone points to comes from this Baker, Gibbons, and Murphy paper, which is that they are informal agreements that are sustained by the value of future relationships. And so one thing to think about too is that firms are going to purchase inputs or sell outputs to their customers. And so there's going to be a transaction that occurs. And so a relational contract would include any of the contingency benefits that occur outside of that contracted exchange. And so these are things that include providing credit. So there's a literature that examines input supply credit, but it's also in this context I found really important because if people have relationships with their suppliers, they can order and ship goods. And so that's really important, right? Because there's obviously pretty big transaction costs to reach a city every single time that you need to purchase inputs. And so if you have a relationship with a supplier and you can call them and say, hey, can you have this, can you like send this on the next bus? Like that saves you a lot of time. And then finally, price discounts. So I think we're all familiar with these. Like once you get to know someone who's selling you something, they might throw in an extra amount of the good for you, or they might give you a price discount as a representation of that relational contract. And so the reason that sellers provide buyers relational contracts is because they value that repeat relationship, right? So you can think of the relational contract as just a way to formalize those long-term business relationships. And so especially in a context like rural Tanzania, relational contracts can help solve market failures, like the fact that there are missing credit markets, but they sort of rely on high search costs. So that's sort of the tension here. So as search costs are high, it means that the value of the relational contract is at a certain level that justifies the high search costs. So here in this experiment, we're lowering search costs. And so we can expect that that's actually going to potentially change how relational contracts are valued with existing customers and suppliers. So let me just tell you what relational contracting looked like at the baseline. So at baseline, the rural firms, this is how much they engaged in relational contracting with their suppliers. And so only about 10% were receiving goods on credit, 30% were receiving price discounts, and 40% specified that they had a repeat supplier, a preferred supplier that they usually went to. And then in terms of input acquisition, about 33% are purchasing locally, just meaning either their community or a nearby community. So these are going to be firms that just need an input like right away, and so they can purchase that from someone nearby. And then about 17% are arranging for goods to be shipped, and 50% are traveling to a city. So that's on the upstream side. And then on the downstream side, you can see that the first thing to notice is that they're engaging in relational contracting at a much higher rate on the downstream side. So they sell goods and services on credit, almost 60% are, 50% are giving discounts to frequent customers, and 23% are arranging special orders and shipping to customers. And so when we ask them who their primary customer base is, 30% are saying their neighborhood, that's the sub-village, and 50% are saying their village. So this is just to highlight the importance of how sort of the community relationships, the firms are providing services to their community much more than they're getting it from their urban suppliers, right? So I'm setting you up to sort of really think about what that would mean in terms of having that asymmetry. So the first thing that we did in order to assess the value of relational contracting was a short discrete choice experiment. And so I'm highlighting this here. I'm not sure that I really have a lot of time to go into detail, but we'll see what I can get through. So a discrete choice experiment elicits the willingness to pay for those benefits that I described associated with relational contracting. And so the experiment was done only for the input side. because we just needed to have something a little bit simpler to draw on. And so the way that we did it is we structured it as 6 different pairs of contracts with 4 different attributes. And then we asked firms in a series of 12 contracts to specify which contract they would prefer, right? And so in this discrete choice, the idea is that you can use a mixed logit specification and sort of identify preference orderings across the entire population. And so we asked, the 4 different attributes that we asked about was a price on a recently purchased input, preference for new versus familiar suppliers, delivery terms, so whether they were going to ship or travel to get the good, and terms of payment, so whether they paid cash right then, whether they got some small share of credit, or whether they paid with mobile money in Pesa. And so mobile money is in here just because I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, right? But there's like a little bit of a liquidity constraint associated with mobile money because you do have to pay to have it turned into cash. So it's not something that you can do right away, but it is like a step toward forming a relational contract. Okay, so this just highlights, so the important thing here is that the price is sort of like the anchor, which you then compare all of the other attributes to. So we asked them a price on a recently purchased input, and then we sort of automatically generated this price spread by just multiplying it by less or plus 15%. And so then you can see like we're kind of stretching out the price distribution and then asking like, would you be willing to pay 5% more in order to get this type of relational contract benefit? And so what that looks like is just comparing these are 2 different types of contracts. So there would be at least 6 of these per firm, and they would just indicate you would go through each of these. This is the first contract and this is the second, and you'd say, okay, would you prefer to pay 0.95% of the price or 0.1% of the price with these different levels of the attributes? Sorry, I actually thought this was the English version, and I realized it's in Swahili. So I think Hosea is with me and can read this, but apologies to everyone else. Okay, so here are the results for that. So you can use that price again as the anchor point to convert these into willingness to pay measures, which I sort of, it's non-binding, it's not incentivized. So I really think of this as eliciting a preference ordering. It's not that I would really stand up and say that I think that people are willing to pay 6% more to work with a supplier, but really relative to these other attributes, working with a known supplier is relatively important to people. So the biggest one though is that people indicated a 33%, a willingness to pay 33% more in order to have goods delivered. And so this is just setting us up for thinking about people really valuing their time and expressing a preference to kind of save time traveling to cities in order to have goods delivered. And the other one that jumped out, so there was like 2 different forms of credit offer. So one would be whether you pay 80% of the cash, pay 80% now, and then you get like 20% credit that you pay the next time, or 50% cash and then you pay the next time. And so obviously the more generous credit, people were really interested in that. So they were willing to pay 18% point more on the input in order to access credit. But part of the reason that this is an interesting finding, the fact that they indicated a willingness to pay 6% more for if the supplier is known, is that in theory with the rest of the contract attributes, we think like, okay, someone works with someone that they know because they get these benefits, right? And so this discrete choice experiment was designed to sort of elicit how much they prefer working with their supplier, like even holding constant all these other contract attributes, right? So people are still expressing a preference for working with known suppliers.
Just have one question on the design. So people were shown how many options here? Like, so each of these firms, right? They were shown once this different contract or multiple times?
Yeah, there were 12 total.
12 in total.
Yeah.
And all characteristics changed from one to another, or?
Yes, all characteristics change from one to another. There's a little bit of So those things can, because yeah, once you have, so this is, once you have, this is like, 7 choices times 2 times 2 times 4, right? So the total choice set can get really enormous, but there's algorithms that you can use that are designed to sort of be able to elicit like the demand curve from them, right? So you don't want to randomly allocate them because you might end up with just like all of the different types of contracts bunched here. And so there's like ways that you can do that. So it's even.
Right, thanks.
Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that relational contracting is important in this setting. And so now when we move into the experimental results, the first one that I highlight is the upstream outcomes for relational contracting and whether firms reported using any new supplier. So the way to interpret these tables is that I have in red, these are going to be outcomes that are significant and sort of survive multiple hypothesis testing. And so then orange, these are outcomes that are significant, but once multiple hypothesis corrections are taken into account, they sort of are back to being not statistically different than 0. So the first thing to notice is that in the upstream treatment group increases relational contracting with their suppliers by 0.1 standard deviations. So those attributes that I described to you earlier, I combined those into a relational contracting index. And then during each survey, we asked each question again. So over time, we're sort of constructing this relational contracting index for each firm. And so we do see that they increase relational contracting with their suppliers. And then what's kind of super interesting is that there's not really any evidence that they actually increase the number of suppliers. So these point estimates are negative and near 0 for whether they had any new supplier. And then in terms of a share of new suppliers relative, because people have multiple suppliers that they go to, there's also negative point estimates, but almost precise or close to 0. And they're searching less. So they're searching significantly less for suppliers on their. So the way this question is asked is not on the Phonebook app specifically, but it includes the Phonebook app. So the reason this is super interesting is because it suggests that people are increasing relational contracting with their existing suppliers. And so when we kind of present them with this technology that lowers search costs, they can actually use that as sort of a bargaining power, a way to gain bargaining power so that they can have the credible threat of leaving their existing supply relationships. And so what also is interesting is that the reverse happens on the downstream side. So let me walk you through that. So on the downstream side, I do see in both treatment arms, regardless of whether you were listed for the downstream treatment, that both treatment arms are decreasing their relational contracting with customers by about 0.11 or 0.12 standard deviations. And then again, no significant changes in the customer base. And so what's probably happening here is that they are sort of updating. They get information. They're like, I'm going to be listed in this phone book. And so I'm updating information about how much I value my relational contracts with my existing customer base, because it's easier for me now to withdraw benefits from my customers. And so one thing to note here, though, is that these new customer questions were asked over the previous week. And so what's not captured here is sort of the extensive margin, right? So this is really just the intensive margin of whether there was enough customer engagement on the platform to kind of push these numbers in a kind of a meaningful way. But this doesn't rule out that someone would have had contact with a new customer during the entire course of the project. Okay.
Sorry, I have a question. I'm not sure I fully understood the interpretation of this negative.
On the downstream?
So what does it mean that there's less contacts with downstream? There's less contracts?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So there's less relational contracting with customers, even though there's not there's not contact with new customers. So it means that firms are withdrawing relational contracting from their existing customer base. So instead of provisioning credit at the same rate, they're saying like, no, I'm actually not going to give you credit on that item, or giving price discounts. They're saying like, I'm not going to keep the price the same.
And why they would be doing this? Would it increase their profit somehow? Like how this technology helps them now to realize that this is optimal behavior?
I think it's that because they anticipate lower search costs for locating new customers, it means that they value their existing customer relationships differently. And so it becomes optimal for them to withdraw some of the relational contracts with their existing customer base, either because they anticipate having new customers or because they sort of know that they have the potential to meet new customers as a result of being in the phone book. So that's sort of the switch on the upstream and downstream, is that it's kind of rebalancing bargaining power a little bit. And so part of the reason that this is interesting too is because I showed you earlier that firms get more relational or give more relational contracts to their customers than they receive from their suppliers. So the fact that this phone book increases relational contracting in the upstream and then decreases it in the downstream is suggestive that their sort of bargaining power is increasing with both their customers and their suppliers.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, good clarification. Thanks for asking. Okay, so the other stuff that's really important to look at here is the search costs and firm productivity. And so the thing I like to highlight within this is firm heterogeneity. So I'll get into that as well. So what I have here is a revenue index, output price index. So this is just whether firms change their output prices, input price index, transport costs, and whether they purchase locally. So these last two are really measures of how much firms value their time. So if transport costs are higher, that's indicative that they're traveling further to purchase inputs. And then if they're purchasing locally, that just means, you know, you're preferring to buy something local and just save on transport costs altogether. And so those are interesting measures in terms of supply chain changes. So on revenue, I don't see any major changes to revenue. I'm not too surprised. Revenue is a very difficult thing to measure, and we put it together as an index. So just sort of asking different points throughout the previous month what the revenue was. And so to have that move would have required like a bigger lift. But I do think of this as sort of like as a digital technology that kind of shifts some of the parameters in a supply chain, but might not be transformative in terms of revenues. And so on the output price, there's some suggestive evidence that some of the upstream firms increased their output prices. And so that sort of is a little bit surprising. It's not super consistent with the story, but you know, it's also pretty wide here. So I don't rely on it too heavily. And then on the input prices, it looks like input prices are trending upwards, but again, it's kind of noisy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the heterogeneity, but it's actually consistent with these transport costs going down. So on the downstream treatment side, they're paying 2 percentage points less in transportation costs, and they're almost 10 percentage points more likely to purchase locally. So I'll go to the heterogeneity first. Okay, so the main division for heterogeneity here is the service firms versus retail firms. And I highlighted a little bit earlier that the kind of input cost acquisition function for these firms is really different. And we can see that in these baseline statistics. So in terms of the value of inputs purchased, service firms are tending to purchase only 70,000 shillings worth of inputs at a time, while retail firms is much higher, right? And this is intuitive, this makes sense. Retail firms are purchasing inventory that they're stocking into a store, whereas a service firm, like you can imagine if you're a tailor or a welder or a barber, you might just need to be purchasing, you know, needles or the little shaving razors or shampoo, things like that. So they're much more of like kind of one-off smaller purchases, and that bears out in these data. And so when you look at the transportation costs, though, retail firms again are paying more, and that's because they have larger orders. But as a share of the inputs purchased, the transportation costs are much higher for service firms. So it just means that a service firm is more likely to benefit from searching locally because they're already pay pretty high transportation costs for purchasing goods. And so service firms, again, are also more likely to purchase locally from the outset. 56% are purchasing locally, 10% are having inputs shipped from the city, and 35% are traveling to the city. And that's way higher for retail firms. So over half of retail firms are traveling to a city, and then more, 25% are having goods shipped, and 20% are purchasing locally. So when I look at the productivity outcomes using this firm heterogeneity, you can see that on retail firms, not much is changing, but a lot is changing for service firms. So service firms are searching less, they're searching fewer locations, they're paying higher input prices, and they're paying lower transportation costs and are more likely to purchase locally. So this just really highlights that service firms are sort of the way that they would use this phone book differs from retail firms in that it's more beneficial for them to save their time and pay higher input costs. Okay, so the last thing I want to show everyone is, I think maybe a good question. So are firms more constrained by upstream or downstream search friction? So the way I look at this is just by examining what happens in the phone book. So since this is a digital phone book, I have pretty good data on who is searching for what. So one constraint that I have, though, is that I can see based on the phone number who is searching for what, but I can't tell if they actually make the call, right? So I can assess whether they're gaining information, but I don't actually know whether they complete the phone call. Okay, so this is just whether a rural firm used and reached a final screen. So a final screen sort of being defined as the point on the phone app where they reach the business listing with the phone number and the location. So you can imagine you're getting information through searching all along because you're still learning about the number of firms that are supplying a certain good in a certain area. So you may not always necessarily reach a final screen. So one thing to note here is that the control mean, these are going to be the firms that are withheld from the phone book. And so when they dial into the phone book, they're sort of sent to this other region that has firms listed that are just outside of their trading region. So we still learn, though, that 50% of control firms are accessing the phone book. So they're curious about it. They want to see what's in it. And then on the downstream and upstream treatment side, it's 10 to 14 percentage points higher. So that makes sense. So the phone book is more relevant for these populations specifically, and it was designed that way. So we do see higher usage for them. And so the control also, whether they searched any urban firm, they didn't have access to the urban firm. So this makes sense that none of them reached an urban firm in the downstream or in the control group. And then in the upstream, 10% of firms searched an urban firm, which is really low, right? And then on the rural firm side, this is how much firms are searching for other rural firms. And so you see in the downstream treatment, perhaps because they're sort of constrained from looking at urban firms, 38% are searching for other rural firms and 23% of the upstream treatment. And then the other thing to see in the phone book usage statistics are whether a rural firm was found in any searches. So these are just looking at over the entire period of the research, whether the rural firm was found by any user, whether they were found by a rural customer, found by an urban firm, or found by another rural firm. And so, of course, it's good to see across the board the control mean here being 0, because we controlled their listing, and so we know they weren't listed in the phone book at all. And so whether they were found by any user, the downstream treatment, almost all of them were found by a customer at some point in the research period. And about half of upstream firms were found by any user. And then when we disaggregate by type of user, we see that downstream treatment, 58% were found by a rural customer and none of the upstream treatment. So again, part of this is verifying that the treatment assignments worked. And then on the found by an urban firm, the downstream treatment, 7% were found by an urban firm. So this just is highlighting that there's some imperfections here. I think, people have different phone numbers and some other things could be happening here. And 12% of the upstream were found by an urban firm. And then I think the most surprising result that comes out of the usage is that 46% of upstream firms and 73% of downstream firms were found by another rural firm. So when I phrase the question as, are firms more constrained by upstream or downstream search frictions, it kind of appears that they're actually most constrained by rural to rural search frictions. And so it's sort of suggestive of that, firms might have some linkages with customers and some linkages with suppliers in urban settings, but the piece of information that they knew less about was where other rural firms are located in their operations. And so that's part of the explanation too for when we see service firms purchasing locally. It could be that they're getting information from a neighboring firm and then they can go there and purchase from them. And that's precisely because they value saving time on getting those inputs. So those sort of the big takeaways from this project. So oh, wow. It's I have 8:44 on the dot. I'm so proud of myself for finishing at the exact right time. So the big conclusions, the takeaways here are that firms respond to changes in search costs by improving their bargaining position relative to suppliers and customers. And so this is consistent with other research that finds that relational contracts are valuable to firms despite operating in relatively competitive environments. And so then we see that these new technologies do have this ability to change the cost structure and sort of disrupt, for lack of a better term, how firms are transacting along the supply chain. And so it's really important as these digital technologies are being rolled out. These are really kind of great research opportunities to understand how some of those pre-existing relationships are going to change in the face of having these new technologies available. So thanks, everyone. My new contact information, I still am checking my UC Davis one, but I updated my email to the Chicago one as well. And so please definitely feel welcome to reach out to me. Super interested in the type of work done here. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that truck come by, but I live in a busy street.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Jessica, for a very clear and interesting presentation. So we can open the floor for any questions. Anybody would like to ask any questions? Also, the fact is, so in South Africa, 5 p.m. is usually the time people go to the beach.
That
finish
sounds
work,
so lovely.
if they live close to the sea, of course. So,
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
So the whole discussion, first, very nice paper. I really enjoyed the presentation. First of all, why do you have just any treatment when you divide between retail and service? This is my first question. And the second is that you are mostly focusing on just getting information on the customers that you have. But another explanation could be that now you know better your competition, right? You know who are your competitors and all of that, especially the less stable can highlight some of that. So how can you disentangle that you know more about your new competitors and not know more about your suppliers? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's a great point. I think I don't do any work to untangle that in this paper. Sort of one of the reasons being that the competition, in order to really be able to measure competition, it really needed to be done as a like sort of spillover research design, where I could get a really good sense of the within community competition and have those as like good measures. So I can't rule out that that's also happening here, but I do think that another sort of expansion of this paper would be sort of rolling this out at a village level instead of at the unit level, so that that would be possible. Yeah. And then I didn't quite get the first question, if you don't mind asking again.
So there is like a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what happens to revenues, profits, and costs when you look for different treatments, right? But then you just combine the two of them when you are looking for the heterogeneity between retail and service.
Yeah.
Is there any reason why you are doing that? Is there anything different? Because I think for revenues, I think you have very opposite signs for the two treatments, right? So is there any reason
they were
to?
opposite signs. Yeah, I think so. I do think that I don't have strong evidence that the different treatment groups really behaved differently. So even on the relational contracting and search stuff, like generally it's moving in the same direction, even if I do have kind of variation in significance. And so once I collapsed it for heterogeneity analysis, it just seemed to make sense to just say, these are the treated firms, and then this is relative to the control, to kind of just make it a little more, a little simpler, but also at that point, you're testing a lot of outcomes. And so when you combine the treatment groups, you can kind of benefit a little in terms of power too.
Are there any other questions? I think Josea was writing something on chat. You can ask the question, or otherwise, please type in, I can read it. Okay, I cannot hear anything. So I also will ask a question. So you suggest that productivity of these firms increases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you also say something, and also that the bargaining power against downstream upstream increases? Can you say something with this aspect that so they essentially make more profits, or that there's money transfer as a result of this technology? So they are more profitable because once they are more productive, and second, now they make more money, or have a greater bargaining power towards others. Is it possible to, or just?
Yeah, I do think the productivity changes are sort of concentrated in the service firms, and so it is sort of it appears to be most of the productivity gained in terms of sort of more efficiency on the input side. And so, like I said, I'm not really seeing a lot moving on revenue, and even the point estimates are in opposite direction. So, but yeah, the idea being that when you're changing your bargaining power, you're sort of just able to like leverage more from those relationships. And so I do think that there is a concern, or maybe not concern isn't the right word, but as a product like this is scaled up, so since this is sort of just a narrow time frame, as a product like this is scaled up, it's not completely obvious to me whether that we would expect that actually the customers are the ones that increase their bargaining power, right? So because I think my prior would have been that customers are the ones who are able to search a lot more, and so you would think that they would be able to extract more relational contracts from the people that they purchase from. And so I don't see that here, and I suspect that part of the reason might just be because I ask the questions to the rural firms and I don't observe sort of the compositional changes directly in terms of the customers. So those are just further things to examine as this product gets kind of rolled out at a larger scale.
All right, I have one more question. So your paper deals in a way with search costs, and I mean search costs sort of relate to switching costs as well. Even though they are not always the same, not necessarily always the same. Like search costs relate to information, switching costs related to like other costs of signing new contracts and so on. So this what you say also in terms of providing credit and so on, this builds some kind of switching cost.
Exactly.
Switching costs can be bad, of course. So, but at the same time, there may be also reasons why people have these relationships that are not true to match. And so on one hand, this might be beneficial, on the other hand, it might be bad if there's switching costs. I guess it's difficult to distinguish what is the source of this relationship, whether they are due to switching costs and they persist, or due to mutual benefits. So I don't know whether there's any way to comment on this based on your research.
Yeah, I think switching costs is a great term. I think I need to start incorporating that a little bit, because I think that's exactly sort of what the evidence is sort of suggesting, is that despite, so you get more slightly better relational contracts with your input suppliers, but you're switching less, right? So it's precisely because those switching costs are high that you sort of kind of still value your existing relationships a lot, because you have that history of repeat transactions. So you know that you're going to be eligible for relational contracts, but the switching cost is, so the switching cost remains high, but then since the search cost goes down, that's sort of where the improvement in bargaining power comes from, because it sort of makes it a little bit of a better credible threat to leave those prior relationships.
Thank you much. There's one question in the chat.
Yeah, I see Hosea has.
So I was wondering if increasing relationship contracts with suppliers and decreasing with customers is a positive or negative thing. In social media, we see firms offering contract information to deliver goods to customers. I'm not sure where.
Yeah, I think the welfare, I think this is a good question, and people ask this a lot, and I'm not sure that I have a great answer, because I'm not sure how to think of the welfare. So if it's sort of just reallocating bargaining power between suppliers and customers, and between buyers and sellers, I don't think it's a really tight measure of welfare. And so, of course, you want to be concerned if you find evidence that market power increases. So if firms are sort of gaining enough enough bargaining power such that they can exercise more market power and is bad for the customers, that would be bad for customer welfare. But I don't have good measures on that. So that would be another thing that would be really worth looking at, and like an expanded program that includes the ability to measure spillovers. So the social media stuff, like that's super interesting, because I can imagine that those are things that are changing all the time. So I remember when we started this work in Tanzania, and Jose, of course, you know the setting much better than I do, but we did see that there is a lot of WhatsApp communication between firms. And so once we looked into that a little bit more, we learned that rural firms that have smartphones are connected into those WhatsApp networks, and so they can sort of make better arrangements using their smartphone. So it really is this sort of last mile of these firm owners and small households that are relying on the feature phones that a product like this would really serve, right? So this is like a technology that facilitates that set of the customer base that doesn't have a smartphone to gain access to information in markets. So that's where I sort of think of the value add.
Thanks a lot. We're almost done with time, but if there's another question, then please ask last question. All right, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank you again for your willingness to present your research. It's very interesting. Good luck with publication. If you have a chance, we would be happy also to welcome you to South Africa, University of Cape Town, or elsewhere. There's JPAL, so if you continue with this type of research, then
I love that.
good points to visit. Anyway, great. I hope we stay in touch, and eventually there will be a chance to see each other in person.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I mean it sincerely, reach out. Let's try and continue having conversations. It can be so hard over Zoom, but I'm happy to continue talking to folks.
All right, thanks a lot. And for everyone, pay attention to the next seminars. They'll be announced soon. Thanks again, and see you soon.
Thanks.